Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology podcast with Robert Glasscock. I'm Thomas Miller. We're answering a string of listener questions, and we have one that represents kind of a phenomenon in the sky, if you will. It's called the Parallax moon. This is a great question. Listen to this.
Listen, Robert, this is Erin, and I have a question about the parallax moon. I understand that this deals with how the moon is measured in relation to Earth. However, when I turn on this feature in my Astro Gold app, my moon completely changes signs. So normally my moon is in Cancer, but when this feature is turned on, it moves back into Gemini. Which is more or less accurate? How do I know what my true moon placement is if it switches signs with just the flip of a switch, so to speak? Thank you for any clarification you can offer. You guys are amazing. Love your podcast.
So, Robert, let's first of all always take a step back and get the context of this. So the parallax moon is a setting, as she mentioned, that can be adjusted on various software programs. And it basically does account for different perspectives of where the moon is in the sky versus where you're viewing it from. So why don't you take that and put it into some simple terminology, and then is it something that you use, and how do you recommend people, when it comes up, how do they think about it?
Several astrologers, including David Cochran and Stephen Forrest and others, are studying parallax today. What it is simply that an object, depending on how close that object is to you, can appear in a different place relative to its background. For example, now as an object is further away from you, parallax decreases. So when you're standing on Earth, for example, if you're born in California and you look up and you see the moon, and someone halfway around the world in Delhi, let's say, looks up and sees that same moon, the moon is the closest to the Earth of all of the objects that we use in astrology. So there can seem to be a difference in about 1, maybe to 2 degrees in zodiacal position from the person in California versus the person in Delhi. So that's parallax. When you get to the other planets and points, they are so far away that it doesn't really change them much. It can change them by a matter of minutes of a degree even, but it doesn't change them much. Well, what we have in the ephemeris listed is one position from Greenwich, England, basically. And so that position is just generally used, but it's measured really to the center of the Earth rather than in that one in the ephemeris, than to different locations on the Earth. So this is why the astrologers that study this really only use parallax in connection with the moon, because as Erin just said, her moon position apparently was in early one sign, and when she uses parallax, it falls back in the later degrees of the previous sign. And she wants to know which one is accurate. And this is an issue for a lot of astrologers. But David Cochran is one. He has said that in the research that he has done, that the parallax-corrected moon seemed not to work as well as the plain old moon. And that surprised him. And he also says that the research that he's done, or that anyone else has done up to this point, is just not definitive. There aren't any research studies that clearly or unambiguously support these astrological theories. So as he says, we're still at the stage of building models and gathering anecdotal evidence and doing exploratory research. So I think these things are fascinating. To me, it really does, as a rule, only make a difference between, say, 1 degree or possibly 2. In her case, the moon changed signs. So when you see that, it's the same thing, Thomas, as if you're trying to rectify a chart and you've been given a birth time. So you have a degree on the ascendant, but let's say it's that we did this with Donald Trump's chart in the practice. It was back in 2017. He had 20, I think, with his stated birth time from a birth certificate. He has 28 degrees of Leo rising. Well, when you see a late degree or a very early degree rising, I want to rectify the chart, because if you don't have the correct midheaven and ascendant, then if you're trying to do things like predict the sex of children, very specific things like that, your whole reading can be totally off. So when I saw 28 degrees Leo rising in Trump's chart, we rectified it to 29 degrees, which is only 4 minutes difference in birth time. And we did that using the midheaven to make the midheaven accurate and correspond to actual events in Trump's chart. And when you do that, then if you go through, as we did in that workshop, you can accurately predict the genders of his children, starting with he's had 5. If he had Virgo rising, it completely changes the signs on the other cusps, because I use equal houses, and those predictions for the children would be wrong. And in that workshop, I also thought we'd try our luck, since the chart was so accurate about his children. I said, let's look at his siblings. What house rules his first sibling, his oldest sibling? That's Mary. And she has Libra on that cusp, the third house cusp of his first sister, and so on. So, in fact, it not only predicted the genders of his children in order, but also the genders of his siblings in order, including the brother that died early from alcoholism. So that's when you're getting into these ideas of parallax, and the parallax moon even being in a different sign. If you're dealing with a woman, especially, because a woman is more responsive to her moon sign as a rule than men are. So the moon and health in a woman's chart are always connected. So if she has a different moon sign with parallax, then she could begin to study the possible health results. The reason I'm going for health is because it's physical. You can't argue with it. You either have this condition or you don't. Unlike things like you have a sunny disposition or describing character traits and personality traits. You either have a scar on this part of the body or you don't. You either have a problem with this organ or you don't, and so on. You either had a miscarriage or you had problem pregnancies or you don't, depending again on the sign of the moon. So you can begin then to study your own life or a client's life based on some health indications that will help you decide pretty much on the spot. Well, her moon's in this sign, can't be in this sign. So that's how at least that's how I approach those kinds of, I don't use parallax moons.
Yeah, I don't either. Steve Forrest, you mentioned Steve. Of course, I've narrated 5 audiobooks for Steve, including the Elements series. He gives a great example of this. It's the example of holding your thumb out in front of, hold your arm out and your thumb sticking up, and then you close one eye, and then you alternate eyes, open and closed, and there's just a slight difference in where your thumb appears to be.
Yep.
That's the kind of thing we're talking about. I just looked in my chart. Mine moves back 20 minutes. So it's very, very slight in my chart. Now, where you're born, I think, would also probably affect this, where you are latitudinally.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah, so that would also affect it. Steve's conclusion was sort of similar to David's. He was basically inconclusive. So that's probably one of those things that you could stick with what has been tried and true, proven over the centuries and millennia, and do okay with it would be perhaps a good way to think. Don't stay up late over this, and don't lose friends over it. That would be the best thing to do. All right. Thank you for that explanation, Robert.
I hope it helps. You're exactly right. Not to lose sleep over. But, these areas of research, Thomas, are always fascinating, and it's how we grow as astrologers. We have a completely different philosophy of astrology today than they held in the medieval times, for example.
Absolutely.
Completely different.
And it's going to get better and better and better ahead, too. If you'd like to get on the train, come join us. You can check out the show notes, get on the Discord channel where Kristen Lawhead is running that brilliantly. We have all of these podcasts on the YouTube channel. It's the Fun Astrology Podcast YouTube channel, but the link is right there in the show notes. And Robert's booking info link is also in there as well. Thank you for listening. We'll be back with more listener questions in the future episodes on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology podcast with Robert Glasscock.